If God is sovereign, then history has to reveal his hand. If he reigns, then it must reveal his plans. We've been looking at the book of Daniel, and we're at chapter 8. And what we're going to see in Daniel chapter 8 is the hand of God in history. I kind of inherit a love for history from my father. He's always been a history buff too. I'm hoping to pass that on to mine one day. And so today we're going to look at a lot of history as it unfolds in the book of Daniel. We're at chapter 8. If you'll turn there with me, Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 is going to fall very neatly into two sections in a lot of the ways that chapter 7 did. Daniel is going to receive another vision from God in chapter 8, and you're going to get an account of that vision from verse 1 through verse number 14. And then beginning at verse number 15 through verse number 26, an angel is going to interpret the vision that Daniel has. So we don't have to struggle to interpret Daniel's vision. The angel is going to do that for us. Because whatever the vision would mean for Daniel is going to mean the same things for us. We happen, however, to be a good ways from Daniel's time. So that our task today is to find out what is the significance of its meaning to us presently in 2015, as opposed to what it must have meant for Daniel in 600 BC. So today, here's what I want us to do. I want us to look at the vision and its interpretation, and then we want to sort of trace the history of it so that you can see that the vision that God gives to Daniel is solidly steeped in human history. And then I want to give you some things to think about at the end as a result of what we're going to see in Daniel chapter 8. If you'll turn with me, I'm going to begin reading at verse number 1. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously." Now, if you remember, the one that he is referring to previously is the vision that he received in chapter 7. Now, just by way of review, Daniel received a vision in chapter 7 of these 4 beasts that the angel interprets as 4 coming kingdoms, or 4 kingdoms because one has already come. We know that historically the 4 kingdoms that he received the vision of was Babylon, which was the kingdom Daniel was living in at the present time. The kingdom that would follow that would be the Medo-Persian Empire. And then the kingdom that would follow that would be the kingdom of Greece. And then the 4th kingdom would be the kingdom of Rome. Now we know that that's how it unfolded historically. We're going to see that Daniel is going to actually prophesy through a vision that it would happen before it actually took place within human history. Here's how we know that those are the kingdoms that Daniel is talking about. Look at verse number 2. He says, "I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai canal. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal." Now, just by way of review, I need to remind y'all, because this is going to become important, that Daniel sees this vision in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. Belshazzar would be the last king of Babylon. He would be the last king of the first empire that he had a vision of in chapter 7. All right? That last king, Belshazzar's 3rd year, is somewhere between 553 BC and 550. I want y'all to keep those numbers in mind, because they're going to play a bit of an important role later. Somewhere between 553 and 550 BC. So here we go. He says, verse number 3, "Then I lifted my eyes and I looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram budding westward, northward, and southward. And then he says, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone who could rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. Now, before we go any further, y'all tell me, what kingdom do you think that is? Two horns, one became higher than the other. It's okay, y'all can answer the question. What kingdom is that? See, that's one of those things where you don't really have to guess, because as I told you, the angel is going to tell you later who it is. All right? So we'll save that for the angel. He has the definitive word. He says, while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west. That's from the west of where this kingdom is, or that ram is. He said it was coming from the west over the whole earth without touching the ground. That says he was moving pretty fast. You know, he's suggesting that the ram that's coming, the goat that's coming from the west, is moving very, very fast. And then he says, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and he rushed at him with all of his might. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram, and he shattered its two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him, so he hurled him to the ground, and he trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Now watch this. Now the story is going to sort of slow down just a little bit, and it's going to center on the horns that come up after, on the head of the goat, after the first horn that he says was a conspicuous horn. Listen to what it says. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up four conspicuous horns towards the four winds of heaven. And then he is going to give us some detail about one of the four horns that came up on that second beast, the goat, and he is going to give us a lot of detail about it, and that seems to be what the chapter sort of centers on. He says, verse number 9, one of them came a fourth, a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great towards, it says, the south, towards the east, and towards the beautiful land. Let me ask y'all a question, just see if y'all are thinking, what land do you think is the beautiful land? That's a good guess. We're going to see later. Good guess, though, Rob. It says, and it grew up to the host of heaven, that's the horn, and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth. And it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host. And it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. That's by the fourth horn. And on account of transgressions, the host will be given over to the horn, along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. That's the fourth horn. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one saying to the particular one who was standing, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifices apply? Y'all stay with it. He says, I see one holy one say to another one, how long will the regular sacrifices be stopped by this fourth horn? And it says, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled. And then the answer came from the second holy one, and he says, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. Strange vision, isn't it? Now let me ask you, just think about it. How likely are you to figure out what that means if the angel does not interpret for you? Well, let me just say this. There's been a whole lot of people who tried to interpret it, and they didn't listen to the angel give the interpretation. There are some who just can't fathom that God could tell the future to Daniel that specifically and have concluded wrongly about what this vision means, and they undoubtedly didn't keep reading. So watch what happens. And then we've got to go back and we've got to understand this vision. But watch this. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I'm reading at verse 15, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man, and I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to me, and I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand the vision pertains to the time of the end. So Gabriel is about to give Daniel an understanding of the vision. Now, while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. He said, behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period, he says, of the indignation. Now, you got to think about this. The end of what indignation is the question you've got to ask yourself. Right? We're going to answer that question in just a few moments, because your tendency is to think at the end of time or at the end of the age, but he says at the end of the indignation. Well, watch this. For it pertains to the appointed time of the end. And watch this. Here's what the angel says. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kingdom of Media and Persia, or Media and Persia. Now, we know about this kingdom, and we know about it historically. The kingdom was made up of two nations that formed an alliance, but the Persian nation became greater than the Median nation, and that's why the second horn grew higher than the first. Y'all get it in the picture? Media and Persia is the kingdom that conquered Babylon, but Persia became greater than Media did historically. All right? By the way, historically, this is the nation that Xerxes or Ahasuerus was king of, who eventually married Esther. All right? That's that same historical nation. And here's what he says. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. Y'all see it in the passage? We don't have to speculate about who the nations are. The angel has told us specifically who they are. Now remember, Daniel gets this vision in 553 to 550 BC. The Persian Empire has not even become great yet. At the moment, Babylon is the great world power on the scene, although Cyrus the Great's power is increasing at the time. And here's what he says. And the large horn that is between his eyes, that's of the goat, is the first king of Greece. Do y'all know who the first king of Greece is? Now, technically, the first king of Greece is probably Philip, right? But it's not a world power when Philip is great, or when Philip is king, right? The first king that the world would know about would be Alexander. That's Philip IV's son, Alexander the Great. The broken horn and the four horns that arise in its place represents four, he says, kingdoms which will arise from his, that's the conspicuous horn's kingdom, or from his nation, although not with his same power. In the latter time, in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue, it says. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, and prosper, and he will perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people, and through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. Listen to what it says. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without agency. And then he says, this vision of the evenings and morning which has been told is true, but keep the vision secret. For it pertains to many days, he says, in the future. Now, I want y'all to see the wonder of this passage in Daniel chapter 8. But to do so, you've got to know a little bit of history. So I want us to put the pieces of this puzzle together historically. Now, the kingdom of Media and Persia becomes great, and the kingdom of Media Persia eventually conquers all of what we know today as the Middle East. From the edge of Asia Minor, as far as Pakistan, the Persian Empire ruled. That would include all the way south down to Egypt, and Palestine, and what was old Babylon, and Syria, and Damascus, and Persia. All of that area was conquered by Cyrus the Great, the first great king of Persia, as Persia became great. But Cyrus did one thing that would eventually ruin the Persian Empire. He tried to go into Greece and conquer Greece too, through Asia Minor. Now, y'all stay with me. Y'all stay with me. Historically, he went into Greece, and that is the story of, y'all remember the movie The 300? The first attempt to turn back Xerxes, that was the next king. The first attempt by the Greeks to turn back Xerxes was by the Spartans and the 300, right? Who made a great stand, but Xerxes succeeded, and he burned Athens to the ground. That united all of the Greek city-states together under Philip, and Philip repelled him, and he went back to the Middle East. But then his son, Philip's son, Alexander the Great, enraged by the burning of Athens, gathered an army to attack the king that would later rule Persia, whose name was Darius III. Now y'all stay with me. Alexander the Great, we all know him from history as the greatest conqueror the world has ever known. The reason we know it is that he conquered the known world faster than any other great kingdom in the world. It was in 334 BC, stay with me, 334 BC that Alexander crossed the river Granicus and had his first war with Darius III. Listen, by 331, that's 3 years, Alexander had conquered the known world. So when Daniel sees the vision of the gate of the goat that's moving so fast that his feet doesn't touch the ground, it was his way of saying this conqueror will conquer so fast that the world would have never seen anything like him. And that's exactly what happened. So, but watch this. The prophecy said that he would die suddenly, that horn would be broken off. Alexander died at the age of 32 from some sort of a fever. Alexander's kingdom then was divided into 4 kingdoms, and they were divided by his 4 commanders of his army. One was Cassander in Macedonia, the other was Lysimachus in Asia Minor, and Ptolemy in Egypt and Palestine, and there was Seleucus in Syria and in Persia. That would be the 4 horns that came up on the goat after the first horn. But then the story tells us about one of the horns who would be skilled in intrigue, and that he would throw down the people of the Holy One and exalt himself to the place of God. We know who that is historically. That is Antiochus IV, known as Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus would go south from Persia and Syria to try to conquer the Ptolemaic Egypt, and he had to pass through Jerusalem to do so. Now y'all stay with me because this is historically good stuff. As he passed through, this is about the time that Ezra and Nehemiah had already come back into the land of Israel and rebuilt the temple and the walls. Y'all remember the story, right, from Nehemiah and Esther. They had already rebuilt the walls. They had already rebuilt the temple. They had resumed the sacrifices when Antiochus went down to Egypt. Antiochus suffered a great loss at the hands of the Egyptians. Watch this. And on his way back north in retreat, right, he found that one of the high priests in Israel had been murdered by Jason and had usurped Onias and become high priest. And to exact revenge, he attacked Jason and his men. Watch this. And then Antiochus went into the temple, slaughtered a pig, which was a desecration of the Jewish temple, and he built an altar to Zeus. And this was in, stay with me, this was in 167 BC. Y'all with me? 167 BC. And the Jews, as a result of that outrage, revolted against the Seleucid Empire and Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. It took them 3 years to win the war, and on December 14th, 164 BC, they cleansed, rededicated the temple after they gained their independence from the Seleucid Empire and Antiochus Epiphanes. By the way, that's the day the Jews celebrate Hanukkah to this day. They rededicated the temple in 164, December 14th, 164 BC. Now, why do I give you all those dates? Because the angel, watch this, told Daniel that it would be 2,300 days that he will cut off the sacrifices. He did that in 167 BC, and 3 years later they rededicated the temple, just like the angel said. Now you got to figure, what is 2,300 evenings and mornings? How many days is that? Or how many years is that? You got to calculate correctly. Because there was an evening sacrifice, and then there was a morning sacrifice. Right? The Jewish day went from sunset to sunset. Ours comes from sun up to sun up. Theirs came from sunset to sunset. So there was 2 sacrifices every day that was stopped by Antiochus Epiphanes. Right? So 2,300 evenings and mornings comes to 1,150 days, which is exactly 3 years. So watch this. From the time Antiochus stopped the offering in the temple, and he sacrificed the animal and set up the altar, the Jews revolted for 3 years, and on December 14th, they were victorious, and Judas Maccabeus cleansed the temple and rededicated it, just as the angel said he would. And look, listen to what it says, verse number 27. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and I carried on the king's business. But I was astounded. On some translations may say I was appalled at the vision, and there was none to explain it, or there was none for him to share it with, no one to carry the burden of what he saw. Now, I need y'all to make sure that you keep in mind what has just happened. Daniel in 553 or 550 BC has gotten a vision of the events that would happen from 550 BC all the way up to 164 BC. That's a lot of time. That's over 389 years of information that Daniel has just received. We are in 2015. What Daniel saw looked forward into time, but what Daniel saw we can look back on in time, and we can see presently that everything Daniel saw that was going to happen actually happened exactly as Daniel said it would. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a powerful witness. That's a powerful witness because most people will confirm that the book of Daniel was written before all of those historical events happened. And yet the angel was right about all of the things that would eventually happen. Now, what does it say to us? I want to give you 4 things that you need to think about as you listen to this vision of Daniel. The first thing you need to consider is that Israel's failure to keep the covenant had universal consequences. It wouldn't just affect Israel, it would affect all of the known world at the time. It would have catastrophic effect. Sin is a serious thing. It affected generations of Jews. See, the Jews thought we would go into exile, and just as Jeremiah said, 70 years later we would come out of exile. They did come out of exile 70 years later, but listen, God's indignation against the nation didn't end after 70 years. What Antiochus Epiphanes would do to the Jews at that time was still a part of God's indignation against them. Here's the second thing you need to see. With a dire future that you can see, what do you do? Where do you place your hope? Do you embrace it as coming in faith, or do you embrace a false prophecy that prophesies prosperity for your future? If you were Daniel and you saw what was coming, if you were Israel and you saw what was coming, and you knew what was in your future was at least 3 years of tribulation, how do you face it? What do you do? What do you put your hope in? Well, I think you would have to do what Habakkuk did when Habakkuk saw that Babylon was coming. He said, I will trust in the Lord. For those who live, he said, by faith. The third thing I want you to see is the patience of the Lord to fulfill his promises. He made the promise through a prophecy to Daniel. He did that somewhere between 553 and 500 BC. And it took over 389 years before the prophecies of Daniel chapter 8 were fulfilled. Is there no wonder that Jesus has not returned yet? God is patient in fulfilling his promises. The last thing I want you to consider is the futility of trusting in the kingdoms of men. Those great kingdoms came and they fell. And none of them could rule with righteousness. None of them could rule in a way that would allow them to have an enduring kingdom, a kingdom that would last. Just as the goat came and ended the ram's dynasty, we saw from chapter 7, something is going to come to end the goat's dynasty. And that would be Rome. But there was coming a kingdom, Daniel would say in chapter 7, after the kingdom of Rome, he said, would be the kingdom of the Son of Man. That would be an enduring kingdom. That's the kingdom that would rule in righteousness, which would allow that kingdom to endure. But listen, if your hope is in somehow the progress of humanity, the vision of Daniel says there's no hope in the progress of humanity. Humanity just gets worse and worse and worse. There hasn't been a human government, a human kingdom that could rule the earth righteously.